Evelyn adjusted her glasses and ran her fingers across the smooth surface of the wooden counter, her gaze drifting toward the tall, arched windows of the library. The golden rays of late afternoon sunlight poured in, creating a warm glow on the countless shelves filled with books. It was quiet, just as she liked it. For Evelyn, the library wasn't just a workplace, it was a sanctuary. Here, surrounded by stories, she could avoid the noise of the outside world and the memories she worked so hard to bury. The familiar rhythm of the day was broken when the main door creaked open. Evelyn glanced up, expecting to see one of the regulars. Instead, a man she had never seen before stepped inside. He was tall, with dark hair that looked slightly dishevelled, and his sharp features carried an air of quiet intensity. He paused at the entrance, his eyes scanning the room with an air of purpose, as if he were searching for something. Or someone. Evelyn quickly looked away, pretending to busy herself with the stack of books beside her. The man's footsteps echoed softly on the polished wooden floor as he approached the counter. She felt his presence before he even spoke. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and smooth, yet carrying a hint of hesitation. "I'm looking for a specific book. I was told it might be here." Evelyn adjusted her glasses again, forcing herself to meet his gaze. His eyes were striking, a shade of grey that seemed to hold secrets, though there was something guarded about them. "Do you have the title or author?" she asked, her tone professional. He hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line before he spoke. "I don't have a title exactly. It's an old book, possibly unpublished. It's supposed to contain personal writings, journals, maybe." Her brow furrowed slightly. This wasn't a typical request. "Journals? Are you looking for something from a specific time period, or—" He slid a piece of paper across the counter. Evelyn glanced down at the note, her curiosity piqued. It wasn't a request form or anything official. Instead, it was a single line of text, written in an elegant, almost antique style. "The answer lies where the words meet the stars." Her lips parted slightly as she read the line again. It sounded like a riddle. "This doesn't give much information," she said, looking back up at him. "What exactly are you hoping to find?" The man offered a faint, almost apologetic smile. "I understand it's vague, but it's important. I'm hoping the library's special collections might have something." Evelyn felt a flicker of intrigue. The library's special collections were rarely accessed. They contained manuscripts, rare books, and other historical materials, many of which hadn't been touched in decades. Her mind drifted to the locked room in the far corner of the library, where those items were stored. "Let me check the archives," she said finally, pushing the note back toward him. "But it might take some time." "I don't mind waiting," he replied. His tone was polite, but his eyes carried an urgency that didn't match his calm demeanor. As she walked away toward the archives, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward the stranger and his mysterious request. There was something about him, something unspoken, that made her both curious and uneasy. Her fingers brushed against the key to the special collections room as she unlocked the door. Inside, the air was cool and slightly musty, the smell of aged paper filling her senses. Evelyn scanned the shelves, her eyes darting across the spines of old, leather-bound volumes. For a moment, she thought she was alone in the room, but then she noticed something out of place. A faint glimmer of light reflecting off the edge of a book on the top shelf. She reached for it carefully, pulling the book down. It was heavier than she expected, the cover worn and unmarked. She flipped it open and immediately saw something unusual. Tucked between the brittle pages was a small envelope, its edges yellowed with age. Evelyn hesitated, her heart quickening slightly. This wasn't supposed to be here. The stranger's note came back to her mind. "The answer lies where the words meet the stars." She slipped the envelope into her pocket and closed the book, her thoughts racing. As she left the room and made her way back to the counter, the stranger's eyes locked onto hers, as if he already knew she had found something. Evelyn handed him the book without mentioning the envelope. "This might be what you're looking for," she said, her voice steady, despite the questions swirling in her mind. "Thank you," he said, his lips curving into a faint smile. But as he turned to leave, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated. Evelyn watched as the stranger carried the book to a quiet corner of the library. He settled into one of the old wooden chairs near the stained glass window, the golden light casting a soft glow over his focused expression. She lingered at the counter, pretending to sort through papers while keeping him in her peripheral vision. There was something magnetic about him, his stillness, the way he carefully handled the book, as if it held the answers to a question only he understood. Her thoughts drifted back to the envelope now resting in her pocket. She couldn't ignore the growing weight of curiosity pulling at her. What was inside? Why had it been hidden there? And more importantly, how was this man connected to it all? She glanced around to ensure the library was still empty, then slipped into the back room. The small, dimly lit space was crammed with stacks of unsorted books and papers, offering her a perfect place to hide. With a quick breath, Evelyn pulled the envelope from her pocket. The aged paper felt fragile under her fingertips, and as she carefully opened it, a folded piece of parchment fell into her hand. Her heart raced as she unfolded it, revealing a map, or at least it seemed like a map. The paper was covered in faded ink. Lines, symbols, and what appeared to be constellations marked the page. At the bottom, there was a short phrase, handwritten in the same elegant script as the stranger's note. "Only the stars can guide you to the truth." Evelyn's fingers traced the faded ink, her mind racing. It didn't make sense. What did this have to do with the stranger's search? And why had it been hidden in the special collections room, untouched for so long? She couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something far bigger than she had anticipated. A sudden noise jolted her from her thoughts. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the main library. Evelyn quickly folded the map and slipped it back into the envelope, tucking it into her pocket. Her pulse quickened as she peeked through the doorway, only to find the stranger standing near the counter, scanning the room as if he were looking for something, or someone. His calm demeanor from earlier had shifted. His shoulders were tense, his movements more deliberate. He turned his head slightly, and for a brief moment, Evelyn thought his eyes met hers through the narrow crack in the door. She quickly stepped back, her mind racing. What did he know? Did he suspect she had found something? Summoning her composure, Evelyn walked out into the library as casually as she could manage. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice steady but her heart pounding. The stranger turned to face her, his expression softening, though there was an edge to his gaze. "I thought I heard something," he said, his tone measured. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Evelyn offered a polite smile, carefully masking the unease bubbling beneath the surface. "Just some old shelves creaking, I'm sure," she said. "This building has its quirks." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary before he returned to his seat. Evelyn exhaled quietly, her thoughts spinning. The map and its cryptic message gnawed at her mind, but something else began to trouble her even more. How much could she trust this man? He had come to the library with a vague story, a cryptic note, and now this map seemed to tie into his search, yet he had said nothing about it. Did he already know what it was? And if he did, why hadn't he said anything? Evelyn retreated to the counter, keeping one eye on the stranger. As he flipped through the pages of the book, she noticed his fingers pause on a specific section. His expression shifted, just briefly, as if he had found something significant. but he quickly closed the book and set it aside, his demeanour returning to its calm, unreadable state. She felt a knot form in her stomach. There was no turning back now. Whatever this was, she was already too deep in it. And somehow she knew the stranger wasn't just searching for answers in books. He was searching for something far more personal, something that could change everything. Evelyn spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to focus on her duties, though her mind was elsewhere. The map and its cryptic message burned a hole in her thoughts, demanding answers. She kept stealing glances at the stranger, who seemed unnervingly calm as he sat at his corner table, flipping through the book she had given him. Occasionally, his eyes darted to the windows or the library door, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the library floor, Evelyn decided to act. She couldn't let the mystery fester in her mind any longer. Slipping away under the guise of organising the archives, she made her way to the back room again, her fingers brushing against the envelope in her pocket. This time, she pulled the map out with determination. She studied the faded ink and symbols more closely, her eyes tracing the lines that seemed to represent constellations. One of the shapes stood out, a distinct cluster that looked familiar. Evelyn grabbed her phone, quickly searching for star maps. After a few moments of scrolling, she found it. The constellation was Orion. But what did that mean? Her mind raced as she tried to piece it together. The phrase at the bottom of the map echoed in her mind. Only the stars can guide you to the truth. Before she could delve deeper, a knock at the back room door startled her. Her heart leapt into her throat as she shoved the map back into her pocket and turned to see Sebastian. She realised she'd started thinking of him by name, standing in the doorway. His tall frame was silhouetted by the warm light of the library, and his expression was unreadable. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice steady, but with a slight edge of curiosity. Evelyn forced a smile, though her pulse quickened. "Yes, just sorting through some old inventory," she replied, gesturing to the disorganised stacks of books and papers. "This room is always a mess." Sebastian nodded, stepping into the room. His presence seemed to fill the small space, and Evelyn found herself backing up slightly, her hand brushing against the edge of the table behind her. He glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on the shelves before returning to her. "This library has more than just books, doesn't it?" he said, his tone casual but laced with meaning. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I suppose it depends on what you're looking for," she said, carefully, trying to match his calm demeanour. His lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained sharp. "I think we're both looking for something. Maybe we can help each other." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. There was no denying it now. He suspected something. But did he know about the map? Or was he fishing for information? She couldn't tell. Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed from the main library. Both of them turned toward the sound, their expression shifting from guarded to alarmed. Without a word, Sebastian moved toward the door, and Evelyn followed close behind. When they reached the main hall, they found one of the large bookshelves tipped over, its contents scattered across the floor. Evelyn's eyes darted around the room, searching for the cause, but the library was empty. The door to the library was slightly ajar, and a cold breeze wafted in, rustling the pages of the fallen books. Sebastian crouched beside the overturned shelf, his expression tense as he examined the scene. "This wasn't an accident," he said quietly, his tone firm. Evelyn's chest tightened. "What do you mean? There's no one here." He stood, his gaze moving to the door. Someone was here, and they were looking for something. Her mind raced. Could it be the same person who had left the map? Or was it someone else entirely? She glanced at Sebastian, whose calm demeanour had given way to something sharper, more urgent. "We need to be careful," he said, turning to her. "Whoever it was, they're not done, and neither am I." Evelyn felt a wave of unease, but she nodded. The crash wasn't just a random accident, it was a warning. Someone else was involved in this puzzle, and they were willing to go to great lengths to find what they were looking for. As Sebastian stepped toward the door, his eyes scanning the street outside, Evelyn's hand instinctively went to her pocket, where the map was still safely tucked away. She had a feeling that this was only the beginning. As the door swung shut behind them, Evelyn felt a creeping sense of vulnerability she hadn't experienced before. The library, her safe haven, now seemed like it was holding secrets far bigger than the old books lining its shelves. She followed Sebastian to the doorway, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. "Do you think they found what they were looking for?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Sebastian shook his head, his sharp gaze scanning the street outside. "No," he said, his tone certain. "If they had, we'd know by now. Whatever they're after, it's still here." His words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and Evelyn couldn't help but wonder what they were after, and why the library had suddenly become the centre of it. Her fingers brushed against the envelope in her pocket again, her mind swirling with questions. She didn't trust Sebastian completely, but for now, she couldn't deny that he might be her best chance at understanding what was happening. Sebastian stepped back into the library, his expression unreadable as he turned to her. "Tell me," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Has anything unusual happened here recently? Anything out of place?" Evelyn hesitated, her pulse quickening. She thought of the map, the cryptic phrase, the way it had been hidden among the old manuscripts, but she wasn't ready to reveal it. Not yet. She needed to understand more before she could decide if Sebastian was someone she could trust. "Not that I've noticed," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady. "The library's been quiet. Today's the first time anything strange has happened." Sebastian studied her for a moment, and she felt as though he could see straight through her. But instead of pressing her further, he nodded, as if he had expected her answer. "Let me know if you see anything else," he said simply, his tone giving nothing away. "Anything unusual?" She nodded, feeling a mix of relief and unease as he turned and walked back to the corner table where his book still sat. As he settled back into his seat, Evelyn retreated to the counter, her mind racing. She had to figure out what the map meant, and she had to do it quickly. Whoever had tipped over the bookshelf wasn't going to stop, and she couldn't ignore the growing sense that she was in over her head. Evelyn waited until Sebastian seemed engrossed in his book again, before quietly slipping into the back room. She pulled out the envelope and unfolded the map once more, her eyes scanning the faded lines and constellations. The name Orion stuck in her mind, but she couldn't make sense of how it connected to the library, or to Sebastian's cryptic search. Her gaze landed on a small marking near the bottom of the map, one she hadn't noticed before. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it resembled a keyhole. Beneath it, in the same elegant script, were the words, "The lock is closer than you think." Evelyn's breath caught. A keyhole? Could there be something hidden in the library itself? She thought of the many nooks and crannies she had passed by every day without a second thought. The idea seemed absurd, but then again, so did everything else that had happened today. She folded the map and slipped it back into her pocket, determined to investigate further. But before she could take another step, a shadow moved in her peripheral vision. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat as she turned towards the doorway. Sebastian stood there, his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked to her pocket, where the edge of the envelope was still visible, and then back to her face. "You found something," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Evelyn's heart pounded. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the library lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. A chill ran down her spine as Sebastian stepped closer, his voice cutting through the silence. "We're not alone." The sudden darkness enveloped the library, turning its familiar walls into an unfamiliar maze. Evelyn's breathing quickened as she instinctively pressed her back against the nearest shelf, her fingers clutching the edge of the counter for balance. Sebastian's silhouette stood still, his sharp frame barely visible in the faint light filtering in from the street lamp outside. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft creak, like the floor protesting under the weight of cautious footsteps. It wasn't Sebastian. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. Someone else was there, someone who wasn't supposed to be. "Stay close to me," Sebastian whispered, his voice steady but low, laced with urgency. Evelyn nodded, though he probably couldn't see her in the dark. She hesitated for a moment, then quietly stepped toward him. The faint scent of old books and the metallic tang of her growing fear filled the air as she moved. Her hand brushed against the edge of his sleeve, grounding her in the moment, but it did little to quell the tension rising in her chest. The sound of movement came again, this time closer. A distinct shuffle, as if whoever was there wasn't trying hard enough to remain silent. Evelyn felt Sebastian shift beside her, his focus sharpening like a predator sensing its prey. "Who's there?" Sebastian's voice cut through the stillness, firm and commanding. No response came, but the movement stopped. The silence grew heavier, stretching unbearably long, and Evelyn felt as though the air itself was suffocating her. Then, out of nowhere, a book fell from a nearby shelf, hitting the ground with a loud thud that made her jump. Sebastian moved quickly, his hand brushing hers as he took a step forward. "Stay back," he whispered, his tone brooking no argument. Evelyn's instinct screamed at her to retreat, but curiosity and fear rooted her in place. She watched as Sebastian reached into his coat pocket, pulling out something small and metallic, a flashlight. The narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the shelves and casting long shadows on the walls. It swept across the library in quick, calculated arcs, searching for the source of the disturbance. The beam landed on the fallen book, lying open on the floor. But beyond it, Evelyn caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow slipping between the rows of shelves, too quick to make out any details. "There!" she whispered urgently, pointing toward the far side of the room. Sebastian turned the flashlight in the direction she indicated, but the shadow was already gone. His jaw tightened as he scanned the area, his sharp gaze betraying his frustration. "They're toying with us," he muttered under his breath. "Who are they?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay calm. "What do they want?" Sebastian hesitated, his jaw working as though he were deciding how much to reveal. "It's not safe to talk here," he said finally, his voice low. "But I promise I'll explain everything once we're out of this." Before Evelyn could protest, the sound of footsteps came again, this time faster, retreating toward the library's entrance. The door creaked open, then slammed shut with a force that made the windows shudder. Sebastian's flashlight flicked off, plunging them into darkness once more. He grabbed Evelyn's hand, his grip firm but not rough. "We need to leave, now." "Wait!" Evelyn protested, her thoughts immediately going to the map in her pocket. "What about—" "Whatever they were looking for, they didn't find it," he interrupted, "but they'll be back, and next time they won't just be scaring us." Evelyn swallowed hard, realizing the truth in his words. Whoever had been in the library wasn't just after books or information, they were after something important, something worth risking exposure for. Sebastian led her through the darkness, his movements confident and deliberate. Evelyn clung to his hand, trusting him to guide her even as her mind raced with questions. When they reached the door, he paused, his free hand hovering over the handle. "Stay close to me," he said again, glancing back at her. "And don't let go." She nodded, her fingers tightening around his. With that, he opened the door, and they slipped out into the cold night. The street outside was eerily quiet, the distant hum of traffic the only sound breaking the stillness. Evelyn glanced back at the library, its darkened windows staring back at her like hollow eyes. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian's gaze didn't leave the street as he answered. "Now we figure out who's playing this game, and we make sure they don't win." Evelyn felt the weight of the map pressing against her leg, the cryptic phrase repeating in her mind like a mantra. "The lock is closer than you think?" She had a sinking feeling that the game was only just beginning. The night air was colder than Evelyn expected, biting against her skin as they walked briskly down the quiet street. Sebastian's pace was quick and purposeful, his hand still loosely holding hers as if ensuring she didn't stray. She wanted to ask him to slow down, to give her a moment to process, but something about the tension in his posture told her this wasn't the time. They turned a corner, leaving the library behind, and entered a narrow alleyway where the dim glow of a flickering street lamp barely reached. Sebastian finally stopped, releasing her hand and glancing over his shoulder as if making sure they hadn't been followed. His expression was as guarded as ever, but Evelyn could see the storm of thoughts brewing behind his grey eyes. "All right," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "No more running, no more cryptic answers. You need to tell me what's going on." Sebastian sighed, leaning against the brick wall behind him. "You're right," he said quietly. "You deserve some answers." Evelyn crossed her arms, her heart still racing as she tried to steady her breathing. Who were they? The person in the library. Why were they there? And what does this have to do with you? For a moment he didn't answer. His gaze drifted past her, toward the street they had come from, as if he were weighing his words carefully. "I don't know exactly who they are," he admitted, his voice low. "But I know what they're after, and I know they won't stop until they find it." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "And what is it they're looking for?" Sebastian hesitated, his eyes flicking to her pocket. "You already know part of the answer, don't you?" Her hand instinctively went to the envelope, her fingers brushing against the fragile paper inside. She felt a flicker of indignation. How did he know? But she shoved it aside. "The map," she said finally. "I found it in the archives, but I don't know what it means." Sebastian straightened, his gaze locking onto hers. "May I see it?" Evelyn hesitated. Every instinct told her not to trust him completely, but at the same time she couldn't ignore the fact that he had been honest, at least partially so far. Slowly, she pulled the envelope from her pocket and unfolded the map, holding it out to him. Lines and symbols. He traced the constellation of Orion with his finger, his brow furrowing in thought. "It's exactly what I thought," he murmured. Sebastian took it carefully, his expression softening slightly as his eyes scanned the faded. "What do you mean?" Evelyn pressed, stepping closer. "What is it?" "This map isn't just a random clue," Sebastian said, his voice quiet but steady. "It's part of something much bigger. A trail, if you will, leading to something valuable, something powerful." Evelyn frowned, confusion mingling with unease. "Powerful? Like what?" He glanced at her, his grey eyes unreadable. "A manuscript, an ancient one written by someone whose work has been lost to history. It's said to contain knowledge that could change everything, for the right or wrong person." Her breath caught. And the people in the library, they're after this manuscript? Sebastian nodded. They've been looking for it for a long time, so have I. Evelyn's heart sank. So that's why you came to the library, she said, the realization settling over her like a heavy weight. You weren't just looking for a book. You were looking for this. I was, he admitted, folding the map carefully and handing it back to her. But I didn't expect to find someone like you in the middle of it. She didn't know whether to feel flattered or insulted. And now what? She asked, tucking the map back into her pocket. What do we do? We need to figure out where this leads, Sebastian said, his tone firm. The map is the key, but there's more to it than what's on the surface. There are layers to this, layers that we'll need to uncover if we're going to stay ahead of them. Evelyn shook her head, disbelief coursing through her. This is insane, she said, or I'm just a librarian. I don't know anything about ancient manuscripts or secret maps. Maybe not, Sebastian said, his voice softening. But you've already proven you're smarter than you think, and you've seen the lengths they'll go to. You're in this now, whether you like it or not. The weight of his words settled heavily on her chest. She wanted to protest, to walk away and return to her quiet, predictable life. But deep down, she knew it was too late for that. The mystery, the danger, the thrill of the unknown, it had already pulled her in. Fine, she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. But if we're doing this, you need to promise me something. What's that? He asked, his expression unreadable. No more secrets, she said firmly. If I'm going to help you, I need the truth. All of it. Sebastian's gaze softened, and for the first time, she thought she saw a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. You have my word, he said quietly. No more secrets. Evelyn nodded, though the knot of tension in her chest didn't loosen. The truth, it seemed, was just as dangerous as the secrets, and she wasn't sure she was ready for either. Sebastian and Evelyn walked in silence for a while, the hum of the distant city their only accompaniment. Evelyn clutched her coat tightly, her mind a whirlwind of questions she wasn't sure she was ready to ask. She glanced at Sebastian from the corner of her eye. He was walking with a purpose, his jaw set, his gaze locked on some distant point only he could see. She felt both reassured and uneasy in his presence, a strange combination she couldn't shake. Finally, they reached a small park tucked between two rows of towering buildings. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching into the night sky, and the faint glow of a nearby lamppost cast long spindly shadows across the path. Sebastian stopped near an old, weathered bench and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, but obeyed, watching as he paced in front of her, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. I need to explain something, he said, breaking the silence. About the map. About why this is so important. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench. I'm listening. Sebastian stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression serious. The manuscript we're looking for, it's not just a collection of words. It's said to contain knowledge that has been suppressed for centuries. Secrets about science, humanity, even history, things that could change how we see the world. Evelyn frowned. That sounds impossible. I know how it sounds, he said, his tone softer now. But I've spent years chasing this trail, Evelyn, and every step has led me closer to the same conclusion. This thing exists, and people are willing to kill for it. Her breath caught at his words. Kill? She echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian nodded, his expression grim. The group we're up against, they've been after this for longer than you can imagine. They're not just scholars or researchers. They're something darker, organised, dangerous. and they won't stop until they get what they want. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. She thought of the shadowy figure in the library, the overturned bookshelf, the way the lights had gone out without warning. It all felt like a scene from a thriller novel, but it was her reality now. She looked at Sebastian, searching his face for answers. "And you? Why are you after it?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping for a moment. When he looked at her again, his expression had softened. "Because it's personal," he said quietly. "Because my family, my father, gave his life trying to protect it." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Evelyn felt a pang of guilt for doubting him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't know." He shook his head. "You couldn't have. But that's why I can't let them find it, Evelyn. If they get their hands on this manuscript, they'll use it for all the wrong reasons. I can't let my father's sacrifice be for nothing." For the first time, Evelyn saw the man behind the mystery, a man carrying the burden of loss and responsibility. She wanted to say something comforting, something meaningful, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the map. "Then, we need to figure this out," she said, unfolding the paper and laying it flat on the bench between them. "Together." Sebastian's eyes softened as he looked at her, and, for a brief moment, the tension between them seemed to ease. He crouched beside the bench, his fingers tracing the faded lines on the map. "This marking here," he said, pointing to the faint symbol near the bottom. "It's a keyhole, but it's more than that. It's a marker." "A marker for what?" Evelyn asked, leaning closer. "A location," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "But not just any location. It's connected to the constellation. Orion, the stars on the map, they're not just symbols. They're coordinates." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Coordinates? Like a map to a specific place?" "Exactly," Sebastian said, his gaze locking with hers. "And if I'm right, that place isn't far from here." Her heart skipped a beat. "You think the manuscript is here? In the city?" Sebastian nodded. "Or at least the next clue to finding it is. But we need to move quickly. Whoever was in the library tonight, they'll figure this out too." Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. The quiet life she had known felt like a distant memory now, replaced by a whirlwind of danger and intrigue. She looked at the map, then at Sebastian. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the fear swirling inside her. "Let's find it!" Sebastian offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, and for the first time, Evelyn felt like she wasn't completely in over her head. But as they stood and began walking toward their next destination, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was already one step ahead. The night deepened as they moved through the empty streets, the faint sound of their footsteps echoing against the buildings around them. Evelyn clutched the map tightly, her eyes darting nervously between the faint markings on the paper and the path ahead. The cryptic symbols and constellations began to feel like an invisible thread pulling her towards something far larger than she could fully comprehend. She glanced at Sebastian, who walked with purpose beside her, his gaze fixed forward. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice breaking the heavy silence. Sebastian glanced at her briefly, then back at the road ahead. "If my guess is right, the coordinates point to an old observatory on the outskirts of the city. It hasn't been used in years, but it aligns perfectly with the constellation markings on the map." Evelyn frowned. "An observatory? What could it have to do with the manuscript?" Sebastian smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "The stars have always been a way to hide things in plain sight. Ancient scholars, astronomers, they used celestial patterns to encode secrets, to lead only those who understood to what they wanted hidden. It's not just random, it's deliberate." The logic made a strange kind of sense, but Evelyn still felt like she was tumbling through the pages of an unsolvable riddle. "And you're certain it's still there?" she asked, clutching the map tighter. "I'm not certain of anything," he admitted, his tone quieter now. "But every lead I've followed has brought me closer to this city, to this library, to this map. If it's not there, it's going to give us the next step." The wind picked up as they left the bustling parts of the city behind, moving toward a quieter, more desolate area where streetlights flickered faintly and buildings became sparse. Evelyn tightened her coat around herself, the cold seeping through her skin. Despite the eerie quiet of the streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She glanced over her shoulder, her stomach twisting as her eyes scanned the darkness. "You feel it too," Sebastian said, his voice startling her. She turned back to him, his grey eyes fixed on hers. "We're being followed." Her pulse spiked. "What do we do?" Sebastian's expression darkened. "Keep walking. Don't look back. If they think we haven't noticed, they might not act until we reach the observatory. That gives us an advantage." Evelyn nodded, though her instinct screamed at her to run. Her grip on the map tightened, the fragile paper crinkling slightly in her hand. She kept her pace steady, matching Sebastian's long strides as the city lights faded behind them. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the edge of a wooded area. Beyond the trees, Evelyn could just make out the silhouette of a dome-shaped structure rising against the starry sky. The observatory. It looked abandoned, its windows dark and broken in places, and a chain-link fence surrounded its perimeter. Sebastian stopped and turned to Evelyn, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get inside. Stay close to me, no matter what happens." She swallowed hard and nodded, her heart pounding as they approached the fence. Sebastian pulled a pair of bolt cutters from his coat, an action that left Evelyn too stunned to question how he had them, and quickly snapped the rusted chain that held the gate shut. The metal creaked as he pushed the gate open, and they slipped inside. The air around the observatory was colder, almost unnaturally so. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine as they crossed the overgrown path toward the entrance. The building loomed over them, its once pristine walls now streaked with grime and graffiti. Sebastian tried the front door, but it was locked. Without hesitation, he led her around the side, where a broken window offered a way inside. Evelyn hesitated, staring at the jagged glass. "Are you sure about this?" Sebastian turned to her, his expression firm. "If we stop now, we lose everything. Trust me." With a deep breath, Evelyn nodded, and followed him through the opening, careful not to cut herself on the glass. The inside of the observatory was even darker than the outside, the faint glow of the moon barely penetrating the layers of dust and cobwebs. The air smelled stale, like damp paper and mildew. Sebastian pulled out his flashlight again, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness. "We're looking for the main control room," he said quietly, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. That's where the alignment with the stars would have been calibrated. Evelyn stayed close as they moved deeper into the building. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their soft footsteps and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Every shadow seemed to move, every distant sound made her heart leap. But she didn't dare stop. As they climbed a rusted spiral staircase, Evelyn's thoughts raced. The manuscript, the map, the mysterious people following them, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. She was about to ask Sebastian another question when the faint sound of a door creaking below stopped her in her tracks. She froze, her eyes widening as she looked at Sebastian. He had stopped too, his body tense, his hand instinctively reaching for something in his coat. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The blood drained from Evelyn's face as she realized they weren't alone. Whoever had followed them from the library was inside the observatory now, and they were closing in. Evelyn's breath hitched, her pulse racing as she strained to hear more. The faint creak of footsteps below echoed through the observatory, deliberate and heavy, sending a cold chill down her spine. Sebastian held up a hand, signalling her to stay quiet. His flashlight flicked off, plunging them into near total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the stars through the cracked dome above. "Keep moving," Sebastian whispered, his voice so low it barely reached her. "We can't let them trap us here." Evelyn nodded, swallowing the lump of fear rising in her throat. She followed Sebastian as he led her further up the spiral staircase, each step creaking softly under their weight. The higher they climbed, the more exposed she felt, the open metal railing offering no protection from whatever or whoever was below. They reached the top of the stairs, stepping onto a narrow platform that led to the observatory's main control room. Sebastian pushed the door open carefully, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. The room was small, with a domed ceiling that had once housed a powerful telescope. Now it was empty, except for a control panel covered in dust and an array of old charts and diagrams pinned to the walls. Sebastian's flashlight clicked back on, its narrow beam sweeping across the room. Evelyn's eyes darted to the papers on the walls, scanning for anything that looked remotely like the map they carried. "There," she whispered, pointing to a faded star chart pinned near the control panel. It showed a constellation identical to the one on the map, Orion. Beneath it, a handwritten note in faded ink read, "When the stars align, the key will appear." Sebastian moved closer, his brow furrowing as he studied the chart. "It's a clue," he said quietly. "The telescope, this place was designed to align with specific constellations. If we can replicate the alignment, it might reveal the next step." Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes darting to the control panel. "But the telescope's gone," she said, gesturing to the empty dome. "How are we supposed to align anything?" Sebastian tapped the chart, his gaze sharp. "The stars are the key, not the telescope. This is about positioning, coordinates. We need to figure out how to use this map and chart together." Evelyn pulled the map from her pocket, laying it flat on the dusty surface of the control panel. Her fingers traced the lines and symbols, her mind racing to connect the dots. "What about the keyhole symbol?" she asked. "You said it's a marker. Could it mean there's something hidden here?" Sebastian nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's possible. Old observatories often had hidden compartments for storing delicate instruments, or, in this case, something much more important." Before they could search further, a noise from the staircase made Evelyn freeze. A sharp, metallic clang echoed up the chamber, followed by the unmistakable sound of voices, low and urgent. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sebastian's jaw tightened. "We need to hurry. Look for anything. Hidden panels, loose floorboards, anything out of place." Evelyn nodded, her fear momentarily overridden by a surge of adrenaline. She dropped to her knees, running her hands along the floorboards near the control panel. The wood was old and uneven, and she pressed against every seam and crack, hoping for a clue. Sebastian moved to the walls, inspecting the star chart more closely. He traced the lines of the constellation with his finger, his movements precise and deliberate. Then he paused, his gaze narrowing. "Here," he said, pointing to a small notch in the wall beneath the chart. "There's something here." Evelyn scrambled to his side, her heart pounding as he pressed against the notch. At first, nothing happened, but then there was a faint click, followed by the sound of gears turning. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a small compartment built into the wall. Inside was an ornate brass box, its surface etched with intricate patterns of stars and constellations. Evelyn's breath caught as Sebastian carefully pulled it out, his hand steady despite the tension in the air. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This has to be it. Before Evelyn could respond, the sound of footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the harsh beam of a flashlight cutting through the dark staircase. The intruders were nearly there. Sebastian's eyes locked onto hers. "We have to go. Now." Evelyn didn't argue. She grabbed the map and followed him as he shoved the box into his bag and led her toward a narrow ladder on the far side of the room. "There's a maintenance hatch," he said urgently. "It'll take us to the roof." They climbed quickly, their movements fueled by the fear of being caught. As they reached the roof, the cold night air hit them like a slap. Evelyn gasped, her lungs burning as she struggled to catch her breath. Below, she could hear the voices of the intruders spreading through the observatory, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Sebastian glanced around, his eyes scanning the rooftop for an escape route. "There," he said, pointing to a fire escape on the far side of the building. "It leads down to the back alley." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She followed him across the roof, her heart hammering in her chest. The distant sound of shouts told her the intruders had discovered the open compartment, and the fact that it was empty. As they descended the fire escape, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. They had the box, but the people chasing them wouldn't stop now. If anything, they would only become more desperate. When they finally reached the ground, Sebastian led her into the shadows of the alley, his hand gripping hers tightly. "We need to find somewhere safe," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've got what they want, and they're not going to let us keep it." Evelyn nodded, her mind racing with questions she couldn't yet ask. As they disappeared into the dark streets, the brass box in Sebastian's bag felt like a ticking time bomb, its secrets waiting to explode. The night seemed darker and colder as Evelyn and Sebastian navigated the winding alleys, their breaths clouding the air. The weight of the brass box in Sebastian's bag felt almost tangible, a silent presence that seemed to amplify the tension between them. Evelyn's mind raced with questions she was too afraid to ask, her thoughts tangling with fear and curiosity in equal measure. After what felt like hours, Sebastian led her into an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. The air inside was musty, and the faint light from the broken windows cast long shadows across the empty space. He motioned for her to stay quiet as he moved to the far corner, checking the area for any signs of danger. Satisfied they were alone, he dropped the bag onto a dusty table and exhaled deeply. "We should be safe here for now," he said, his voice low but steady. "But they'll be looking for us." Evelyn leaned against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Who are they, Sebastian?" she asked, her voice trembling with both fear and frustration. "Why are they willing to go to such lengths for this? What's in that box?" Sebastian hesitated, his eyes flicking to the bag as if the answer lay inside. "They call themselves the Covenant," he said finally. "A secretive group, centuries old. Their purpose has always been to control knowledge, especially knowledge that could threaten their power. The manuscript, it's something they've been searching for, something they're terrified will fall into the wrong hands." Evelyn frowned. "And by wrong hands, they mean anyone but theirs." He nodded. "Exactly. They've silenced people, destroyed evidence, and rewritten history to keep their secrets buried. If they get their hands on this," he gestured to the bag, "they'll make sure it disappears forever." Evelyn's stomach churned. "And the manuscript? What kind of knowledge does it hold? Why is it so dangerous?" Sebastian opened the bag and carefully pulled out the brass box. He set it on the table, its intricate engravings glinting faintly in the dim light. "The manuscript is rumoured to contain ancient knowledge about science, medicine, technology, and truths about our past that could challenge everything we think we know. Some say it even holds the key to understanding the origins of humanity." Evelyn's breath caught. "That sounds Impossible. I thought so too at first, Sebastian admitted. But my father believed in it. He spent his entire life chasing this trail, piecing together fragments of history the Covenant tried to erase. He died protecting this knowledge. Evelyn's heart ached at the weight of his words. And now it's your turn, she said softly. Sebastian didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the box. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. Evelyn watched as he slid it into the lock on the front of the box, the faint click of the mechanism breaking the silence. Inside, nestled within a velvet lining, was a small stack of yellowed parchment bound with a delicate string. The papers were brittle with age, the ink faded, but still legible. Sebastian's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the manuscript from its resting place. Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes widening as she took in the intricate symbols and diagrams scrawled across the pages. Some were written in languages she couldn't recognize, while others were mathematical equations and star charts that seemed impossibly advanced for their time. "This is it," Sebastian whispered, his voice reverent. "This is what they've been searching for." Evelyn reached out, her fingers hovering above the parchment but not touching it. "It's beautiful," she murmured, though she couldn't fully comprehend what she was looking at. "But how are we supposed to understand any of this?" Sebastian nodded toward the symbols. "My father left notes. He was able to decode some of the writings before—" His voice trailed off and he shook his head. "We'll need time to decipher the rest, but there's something here, something that will change everything." Before Evelyn could respond, the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Her heart leapt into her throat as she turned toward the entrance. Sebastian's expression darkened, and he quickly placed the manuscript back into the box, snapping it shut. "They found us," he said, his voice tight with urgency. He grabbed the bag and slung it over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the room for an escape route. "We can't stay here." Evelyn's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move as Sebastian grabbed her hand and led her toward a side door. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by low voices that sent a chill down her spine. Whoever the Covenant was, they weren't giving up. As they slipped out into the night, Evelyn couldn't help but glance back, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. She didn't know how this would end, but one thing was clear. The manuscript was more than just a relic of the past. It was a key to something far greater and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And now, there was no turning back. The cold night air hit Evelyn like a slap as they emerged from the side door, their hurried footsteps crunching against the gravel outside the warehouse. Sebastian gripped her hand tightly, leading her toward the back alley that snaked between rows of derelict buildings. Behind them, faint voices and the sound of heavy boots echoed, growing closer with every passing second. Evelyn's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Her mind raced as she tried to focus on Sebastian's movements, his purposeful strides and the way he scanned the area for any sign of an escape route. The brass box, safely tucked in his bag, felt like a beacon for the danger that relentlessly pursued them. "This way," Sebastian whispered, his voice steady but urgent, as he pulled her toward a narrow gap between two buildings. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it provided a temporary barrier between them and their pursuers. Evelyn pressed her back against the cold brick wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could hear the voices more clearly now, sharp and commanding, as the figures moved closer to the warehouse. She glanced at Sebastian, his expression focused and unyielding. "What now?" she asked in a hushed tone, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of the open," he replied. "There's an old train yard nearby. If we can make it there, we might be able to lose them." Evelyn nodded, her fear momentarily overridden by the clarity of a plan. She followed Sebastian as he led her through the narrow alley, their movements careful and quiet. The distant sound of sirens echoed faintly in the background, mingling with the city's hum, but it did little to mask the growing threat behind them. As they emerged from the alley, the train yard came into view, a sprawling expanse of rusted tracks, abandoned cars, and crumbling structures. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like a trap waiting to be sprung. Sebastian motioned for Evelyn to stay low as they crossed the open ground, weaving between the rusted train cars. Her heart hammered in her chest, her senses on high alert as every creak of metal and crunch of gravel felt amplified in the stillness. She clutched the map in her coat pocket, its fragile edges crumpled slightly from her grip. They ducked behind a derelict freight car, its peeling paint and broken windows offering little comfort. Sebastian crouched beside her, his breathing controlled, and even as he scanned the area. Evelyn wanted to ask how he remained so calm, but she knew there wasn't time. "They're splitting up," Sebastian murmured, his sharp eyes catching movement at the edge of the yard. "They'll fan out and try to corner us." "Then what do we do?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible. He turned to her, his grey eyes meeting hers with a mix of determination and reassurance. "We keep moving. Stick close to me, and whatever happens, don't stop." She nodded, swallowing hard. Her fear hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something sharper, a determination to see this through, no matter what it cost. The manuscript wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a responsibility, one she couldn't abandon. They crept along the side of the freight car, the sound of their pursuers' footsteps growing louder. Evelyn could see flashlights cutting through the darkness, their beams bouncing off the rusted metal and casting eerie shadows. The figures moved methodically, their voices low but commanding, like predators stalking their prey. Sebastian suddenly stopped, his body tense as he gestured for Evelyn to freeze. She held her breath, her eyes following his gaze to a narrow maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the tracks. It was dark and uninviting, but it offered a chance to escape the tightening net around them. "Through there," he whispered, pointing to the tunnel entrance. "It's tight, but it'll get us out of sight." Evelyn hesitated for only a second before nodding. Together, they crouched and slipped into the tunnel, the cold metal walls pressing against them as they moved deeper into the shadows. The air was damp and musty, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed around them. As they crawled through the narrow space, Evelyn's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that the Covenant's reach extended far beyond what she could see, their presence like a looming shadow over everything. The thought of what might happen if they were caught sent a shiver down her spine. When they finally emerged on the other side, they found themselves in another section of the train yard, this one even more desolate than the first. Sebastian helped her to her feet, his grip firm but gentle. "We've bought ourselves some time," he said, his voice low. "But we're not out of this yet." Evelyn looked around, her eyes scanning the endless rows of abandoned trains and overgrown tracks. "Where do we go now?" she asked, her voice laced with exhaustion. Sebastian pulled out the brass box, his fingers brushing over its intricate engravings. "We figure out our next move," he said, his tone resolute, "and we do it fast." As he opened the box and began examining the manuscript once more, Evelyn felt the weight of their situation settle heavily on her shoulders. They were running out of time, and the Covenant was closing in. But deep down, she knew there was no turning back now. Whatever secrets the manuscript held, they had to uncover them before it was too late. The faint glow of the distant city lights illuminated their grim surroundings, casting eerie shadows across the abandoned train yard. Evelyn crouched next to Sebastian, her eyes darting to every rusted corner and shadowy figure her imagination conjured. The brass box rested between them on the ground, its surface catching the faintest glimmers of light as Sebastian carefully opened it again. His movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as though the manuscript it contained were sacred. Sebastian spread the ancient parchment on the flat surface of an old rail car. The faded ink glimmered faintly in the dim light, its intricate symbols and diagrams demanding their attention. Evelyn leaned closer, her breath creating soft puffs of mist in the cold air as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. "This symbol," Sebastian muttered, pointing to an ornate marking near the bottom of the page. It was a small, circular design intertwined with the constellation of Orion, almost like a seal. Around it were tiny inscriptions written in a language Evelyn couldn't identify. "It's the same as the one on the map. It's a cipher, a way to decode the text." Evelyn furrowed her brow, studying the symbol. "A cipher? Can you read it?" "Not fully," Sebastian admitted. "But I've seen this script before. My father's notes described it as an ancient hybrid, a mix of languages, both known and lost. He believed it was designed to hide the truth from anyone who didn't know how to look for it." Evelyn frowned. "So, it's a language meant to confuse." "Not just confuse, protect," Sebastian corrected. He flipped through the manuscript, his eyes scanning the faded words. "The Covenant's power has always been built on what they could hide from the world. This manuscript, it's a key to knowledge they've kept locked away for centuries." Before Evelyn could respond, a soft rustling sound cut through the air, sharp against the stillness. She froze, her heart skipping a beat as her eyes darted towards the source of the noise. Sebastian's body tensed immediately, his hand hovering near his side where she now noticed he carried a concealed knife. "Stay low," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Evelyn crouched lower, her body pressed against the side of the rail car. The sound of footsteps grew louder, crunching against the gravel. Flashlight beams danced across the train yard, the figures searching methodically. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, the cold air suddenly feeling suffocating. "They've caught up," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sebastian nodded grimly. "We need to move, but we can't leave the manuscript." He quickly rolled the parchment back up, tucking it safely into the brass box and securing it in his bag. Evelyn's mind raced as she tried to think of an escape route. Every path seemed blocked by shadows and the relentless pursuit of their enemies. "They're cutting us off," she said, her voice tight with panic. Sebastian glanced around, his sharp eyes scanning the area. "There," he said, nodding toward a series of stacked freight containers near the edge of the yard. "We can use those to stay out of sight." Without waiting for her response, he grabbed her hand and pulled her along. They moved quickly but quietly, weaving between the rusted trains and abandoned equipment. Evelyn's heart thundered in her chest as the beams of light swept dangerously close, illuminating the ground just inches from where they had been moments before. As they reached the containers, Sebastian helped Evelyn climb onto the first one. The cold metal stung her hands, but she gritted her teeth and pulled herself up. Once on top, they crouched low, hidden by the container's height and shadows. From their vantage point, they could see the Covenant agents spread out across the yard, their movements coordinated and precise. "They're not just searching," Evelyn whispered. "They're hunting us." Sebastian nodded, his jaw tightening. "They won't stop. Not until they have the manuscript, or until we're out of the picture." Evelyn shivered at his words, the gravity of their situation sinking in even deeper. She clutched the map in her pocket, her fingers brushing against the fragile paper. "There has to be a way to stop them," she said. "If we can figure out what the manuscript says, we can stay ahead of them." Sebastian's eyes softened as he looked at her. "We will. But first, we have to survive the night." The sound of voices drew closer, and Sebastian motioned for her to stay silent. They waited, their breaths shallow as the figures passed by below, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Evelyn's muscles ached from staying so still, but she didn't dare move. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the voices began to fade, the beams of light moving further away. Sebastian exhaled quietly, his body relaxing slightly. "They're heading toward the north end of the yard," he said. "This is our chance." Evelyn nodded, her body trembling with both fear and adrenaline. Together, they climbed down from the containers, their movements quick and deliberate. Sebastian led her toward a gap in the fence at the edge of the yard, the narrow opening their only way out. As they slipped through the gap, Evelyn felt a flicker of relief. But it was short-lived. In the distance, she heard the sharp bark of a voice, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps running toward them. "They've seen us," she gasped. Sebastian grabbed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Run," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Don't look back." And so they ran, the night swallowing them as the chase continued,